introduce John Hale. Dr. John Hale is an associate professor of educational history at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. His research focuses on the history of student and teacher activism, grassroots educational programs, and the role of Southern black high schools during the civil rights movement. His award-winning book, The Freedom Schools, A History of Student Activism, or Activists, on the front lines of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, examines the role of educational activism during the Civil Rights Movement. He is also the co-editor of the Freedom School newspapers, writings, essays, and reports from student activists during the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Hale currently serves as the executive director of the Charleston Freedom School, co-director of the Quality Education Project, faculty advisor to the student chapters of the South Carolina Educational Association, and vice chair of the Burke High School Improvement Council in Charleston. Before I let you give him applause and bring him on, before coming here to BYU, I taught for 5.5 years at Auburn University down in Alabama. The Civil Rights Movement was a tectonic shift down there in the Southeast, and in many ways, those fights are still ongoing. And it's still an issue. The university I was teaching at, Auburn, was under a Supreme Court mandate to diversify because it was seen as a white school. And there are historically black colleges down there as well. And there's still a lot of these racial tensions, racial divides. Really enjoyed reading the paper that Dr. Hale has presented or is about to present, because it touches on a lot of those same fundamental human rights and human dignity aspects that are so important to all of us. And certainly his work is forwarding what I think is some of the most important work of our time. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Dr. Hale for coming today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. And Dr. Davis, thank you for the invitation to your beautiful, beautiful campus. And thank you for the support. And I especially appreciate our moderators and discussants, Dr. Clay Thompson and Dr. Deswinas, for reading the paper. You know, Dr. Clay last night at dinner reminded me how long the paper was that I sent them. And it was, I think, 52 pages, he said. 58 pages, okay. So,
don't short me, I read every page.
You know, I gave him a broad paper, which turned out to be a chapter in my book, and I didn't quite know what I was going to focus on, so I gave him a broad paper. So thank you for reading that. I certainly appreciate that. And it is an absolute pleasure to be here today, and it's a pleasure to be here specifically on this campus in Provo in the state of Utah to talk about race and civil rights and how education, you know, I write with a conviction and I teach with a conviction as well as serve my community and field based on the notion that education in the 21st century is the defining civil rights issue of our time. So I'll also step outside of a scholar's role and as a community organizer also, you know, try to communicate how important quality education is at the local level and really how we need students and young people engaged at the local level to really actualize education as a constitutional right and also quality education as a constitutional right. And my research is largely based on this very notion. Education has been historically, since Reconstruction, a defining civil rights issue, and the struggle for quality education has been a definitive moment in American history. So what I do with my book, The Freedom Schools, is I trace one of the most successful historic examples we have of grassroots organization at the K-12 level and how this really helped shape the civil rights movement in Mississippi and how this movement actually has deep social and political implications for us today. And the Freedom Schools are born out of a larger movement. You may have heard of it, the Freedom Summer Project of 1964. And the Freedom Summer Project is essentially the largest voter registration drive during the Civil Rights Movement. Over 1,500 white volunteers descended upon the state of Mississippi to register as many voters as they possibly could. Historian James Silver then called Mississippi the closed society. And the logic among organizers was if you could break that closed society, if you could open up Mississippi and you could register African American voters, that you're going to change that society. So the Mississippi Summer Project of 1964 focused on registering voters. The Freedom Schools, as we'll talk about later in the presentation, were actually sort of an afterthought. The Freedom Schools were a way to occupy these well-intentioned, yet sort of soon-to-be disillusioned white volunteers who were moving to Mississippi. Those Freedom Schools gave them something to do. And one of the unintended consequences is one of the most successful parts of Freedom Summer. But the Summer Project itself has been captured in the American consciousness and our imagination. Mississippi Burning, for instance, is about Freedom Summer. Stanley Nelson's Freedom Summer documentary released 3 years ago is about Freedom Summer. Bruce Watson's Freedom Summer, you may be seeing a theme, Freedom Summer, Freedom. It's captured not only civil rights historiography, but as well as American consciousness who is concerned about the civil rights movement. This is a definitive movement and a moment in American history. And I say this because when we look at how Freedom Summer has been historicized, we largely see it from the white volunteers' perspective. And these are just a few headlines. When the press was paying attention to Freedom Summer, they were concerned primarily with these, what they would call, crazy white folks who went down to Mississippi for a summer to get, really literally risk their lives. They were the story. How could America's white sons and daughters move down to the worst state, arguably, in race relations in the United States? What were they thinking? This was the news story. And in early June 1964, when 3 civil rights activists disappear, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, and this is what inspires Mississippi Burning, the nation becomes captivated by their disappearance. Why? Because 2 of those 3 civil rights activists were white. And Bob Moses, Dave Dennis, Fannie Lou Hamer, et cetera, knew that if you could bring white volunteers to Mississippi, you were going to raise the consciousness of white America. Without white volunteers, you would not have a successful movement. So what my project does is I attempt to decenter that narrative, to take the attention off the white volunteers and to focus on those actually involved in the Freedom Summer Project. And these are the voices of students. The second way I seek to decenter this history or decenter this narrative is to actually look at the age of participants. When you study the civil rights movement here at BYU, and if you take Professor DeSwines's class or others, you may get the impression that, actually probably not in your class, given your book, you're looking at much younger as I am. But a lot of people get the impression that college students, people your age, were at the center of the movement. And they were very much involved, but what I do with my research is to look at, a much younger population. When you look at the images, these iconic photographs of the civil rights movement, you see middle schoolers and high schoolers at the front lines of the civil rights movement. College students were there, yes, but we have to look at middle and high schoolers and how central they were to the movement. So in my research, I try to tell the history of the Freedom Schools and the history of grassroots activism, educational activism, from the perspective of those involved in the civil rights movement. And this personally, I don't talk about this much, but I want to, because this has everything to do with whiteness. And so here I was as a 23-year-old white man from Wisconsin, in a very rural part of Wisconsin, which is reflective of Utah in many ways. Diversity was primarily defined by, what food you ate. Do you like bratwurst or do you like Italian sausage? Would define how you were different in Wisconsin. I know that's not the case in Utah, but I'm saying is diversity is quite limited in terms of racial diversity. So here I am following the footsteps of the white activists moving to Mississippi. And I understood very quickly how problematic this was. I didn't know anything about the culture of Mississippi. I didn't know anything about the students I was going to be writing about. And here I was, a white man telling, quote unquote, their story. So I quickly learned, being on the ground for a few months in Mississippi, that I had to tell the story from the perspective of the students who were part of Mississippi. And when you follow the students, you decenter that narrative, and you learn things that you need to know if you are going to enter civic engagement with an open mind, open heart, and of course with a critical consciousness. And in the process of my research, I met students like the young man pictured here, now older gentleman, distinguished gentleman, Eddie James Carthen. Right, here's a picture of him in 1964 at the age of 14. And when I meet Eddie James Carthen, the first question I have, a much younger version of myself is, well, how'd you become involved in the Freedom Schools? And to answer that question, he takes me back to his ancestors who were slaves in the Mississippi Delta. He tells me about his great-grandfather who his grandfather who was freed from slavery. He tells me about his father who was a landowner in Mississippi Delta. And to be a black landowner in Mississippi Delta is to truly be a distinguished member of the community because you are not dependent upon the white power structure for income. So Eddie James Carthen descends from a heritage of resistance, and to own land in Mississippi is in fact to resist the status quo, because African Americans were expected to work for somebody. To own land suggested that you could resist that social order. And being a landowner, Eddie James Carthen and his father could engage in economic cooperatives. They could share property. They could share farming equipment with others. And this allowed them to resist a white dominant economic structure. So Eddie James Carthen, in the way he relayed the story to me, entered the Freedom School since birth. He was already active given his heritage that he inherited. Aurelia Mitchell, not pictured here, she would not allow me to use her picture in my book or in my research. But her father, pictured here, W.B. Mitchell, is a professor of economics at Rust College, which is in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Second oldest black college and university in the state of Mississippi. When I asked her, again, foolishly, one of the first questions I asked, and I used to ask, I changed my oral history methodology. I've revised it significantly, to say the least, since I started this research in 2004. But she began the story with her father, W.B. Mitchell. He was a business and economics professor at Rust College. He was a chair of the department. He was involved in the local chapter of the NAACP. Through his connections at Rust College and through his connections with the NAACP, there was a very cosmopolitan, educated environment that she was exposed to. They had an integrated faculty. They'd have white professors over, anthropologists, historians, other economists, coming over to her home discussing communism, the merits of communism, and imagine, back then that wasn't such a criminal activity at one point in time. Democracy, segregation. Her father knew Dr. Martin Luther King. He stopped by her home as she was a young child. So before she went to the Freedom School, she was already an activist herself. So what this taught me as a white researcher was that when we focus on white activists and their contribution to the movement, this implies that they started the movement, that people were sort of innate or passive before white activists moved to Mississippi. But when you sit down and talk to those who were actually attending the schools, they were already active before the Freedom Schools. So not only does this decenter the narrative, this expands the periodization of the civil rights movement, which Jacqueline Down Hall will call the long civil rights movement. They were already active before the summer of 1964. Now, you won't get that impression if you're reading the New York Times, for instance, or if you watch Mississippi Burning, where white people capture the attention. But if you just shift the lens a little bit, you can see how active these young people were. So the second way, by following the students and getting to know them, getting to know their backstory, who they were, I also quickly realized how the conception of youth or the categorization of youth did not apply to African American young people in Mississippi and indeed across the United States. The gentleman who taught me this message personally was, he's pictured here, Hezekiah Watkins. So Hezekiah Watkins here, you can also get this picture in Eric Etheridge's book, is his photographs on the Freedom Riders. And the Freedom Riders were, and there's numerous, Stanley Nelson has another documentary on the Freedom Rides as well. Freedom Riders are desegregating bus terminals from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Well, by the time they got to Rock Hill, South Carolina, they were assaulted, and of course, the infamous case in Anniston, Alabama, they were, everyone was dragged off. Actually, no, they were locked in the bus, and someone threw a firebomb inside, and somehow they broke through the bus doors, and they escaped. So you see the photograph of the burning bus in Alabama, and little do you know, 3 people later died of the smoke inhalation and injuries suffered. But regardless, Hezekiah Watkins, he was in middle school, and he was watching the Alabama bus burning. And they know that the next major stop is in Jackson, Mississippi. So as a young man, he's very curious about it. And he and his friends want to go check out what they call these freedom fighters. So those who are on the buses are heroes. And they want to go see them in person. They've been reading about them in the newspaper. They're on the TV. They're coming to their town in Jackson. And he goes down to see them at the Greyhound bus terminal, which still exists in Jackson, Mississippi. And in the excitement of the event, there's hundreds of people down there. And he's in middle school, so a little bit shorter at the time period. So he's pushed to the front, to almost where he's touching the bus. And he gets swept up with the Freedom Riders, and he's thrown in a paddy wagon, and he's arrested, and he's sent to Mississippi's notorious prison called Parchman Penitentiary. And in order to, teach a lesson, quote unquote, teach a lesson to these activists, he's not sentenced to death, but he spends a week on death row. So as a 14-year-old kid, he's next to these hardened, seasoned criminals about to be executed, so he's terrified. And his parents don't know where he is. So they assume he's dead or somehow was killed in the result of these protests. But when the governor finds out that he's only 14, he's embarrassed that happened. He's released, but he goes back home and he becomes activated. What started out as curiosity becomes a burning passion to change the social order in Mississippi. But through him, we can see not only, again, are these young people already active before the Freedom Summer Campaign of 1964, we can also see that there's something going on in the legal structure, in the social structure of the United States, where a 14-year-old child is punished as an adult in Mississippi. Later that same summer, in August of 1961, in the very small town in the southwestern part of the state in Macomb, Mississippi, students walk out in protest when one of their peers, Brenda Travis, she's not in this particular picture, but she's arrested for sitting in at the lunch counter at the local bus terminal in Macomb, Mississippi. She's arrested. Again, she's 16 years old, so she's sentenced to 30 days in prison. Once she's released from prison, she's expelled from her high school. And this is when students walk out and protest. They say, how dare you expel her for just demonstrating her rights as a citizen to eat wherever she wants to, and she was expelled from school. And here's where actually Mississippi, and this is a project of my next book project, Mississippi actually begins to amend their state laws to criminalize young people, not even yet legally adults. So the state of Mississippi actually goes in there and removes her. They not only remove her from school, but put her in a reformatory school outside of the state, saying that she has to be educated and raised elsewhere because of her criminal mindset. So the state begins to change its laws to better persecute young people, again, not yet adults, persecute her for her activism. And this, of course, we're going to be the origins of what we call the school-to-prison pipeline. Young people in desegregated spaces are criminalized at much higher rates than white students are to this day. Regardless, at this point, Hezekiah and Brenda Travis illustrate that not only are young people involved in the civil rights movement, that they themselves, are facing the violent reality of Jim Crow, a segregated United States. So they are, by law, children, but yet they are never treated as such. Now, to go back to white volunteers, you can't write a book on Mississippi Freedom Summer and not write about white people. There were over close to 2,000 white people in Mississippi coming from all across the country. In my research, I did not come across anybody from BYU. So if you know anybody, please let me know. I'd be happy to amend. They won't let me publish a book again, but I can on my blog or something like that. But white people all across the country, from the West Coast to the East Coast. the Midwest, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the great state of Wisconsin. That's where I'm from. So we're sending white students down to Mississippi to volunteer. And what you begin to see is these white volunteers are incredibly naive. And they weren't using the term at the time, but what you can also see is that they were suffering from what we now call, I'm not being presentist in this moment, but looking back, we would call them sort of white saviors, that they had a notion that they could save these poor young black children who were, suffering from the indignities of Jim Crow, which was true. One such person is Frances O'Brien. She was going to school at the University of Oregon. Pacific Lutheran University. She later transfers to the University of Oregon. When she hears the call for white volunteers to move to Mississippi, Bob Moses has a press conference in January of '64. They publish an advertisement in the New York Times, in The Nation, so left-leaning newspapers. They publish it, and she reads it. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee are sending activists all across college campuses to recruit this army of volunteers, and she hears the call and she responds. In my interviews with her, she utilizes this rhetoric of saving people. She's a practicing Christian. She thinks it's her Christian duty to help other people, so she accepts a call to Mississippi. Very similarly, Sandy Siegel, at the age of 22, he's at UC Davis. He's spending a lot of time at Berkeley. A few of the Berkeley activists invite some of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists to speak on their campus, and he receives the call. He's an education major, so he feels compelled to enter the field of education to, again, help those who are less fortunate. So again, some of the rhetoric and some of the language of saving these poor African American students. So he responds to the call as well. And it's important here that we begin to problematize the role of white activists in the movement. And again, I'm not denigrating or taking away the fact that they were giving up their lives, and they did. But to also look at the assumptions that they were making when they were going down there. So another teacher I got to know really well, Liz Fusco, who later becomes the Freedom School coordinator, something she says is, we thought we were pretty hot stuff. We thought we knew everything going into Mississippi. We thought we knew what needed to happen in order to break down that closed society of Mississippi. Well, lo and behold, when they get to the Freedom Schools, they're shocked to meet students like Eddie James Carthen, Aurelia Mitchell, Hezekiah Watkins, Brenda Travis, to meet young people who had been seasoned, who are basically seasoned veterans of the movement, and somewhere yet were not even teenagers, who are speaking the lives of activists. They're living the lives of activism that they sought to enact in Mississippi, but to learn that people much younger than them were already active in the movement was humbling, to say the least. And they were also shocked because a lot of these white volunteers were under the impression that they were bringing the movement to Mississippi. So again, James Silver's notion of a closed society suggests that you're closed from everything happening around the country. So they were shocked to see that. And even Stanley Nelson doesn't talk about this in his documentaries, but the NAACP was already active in Mississippi. You had students, young people being arrested since the early 1960s. People were already active. So sort of following a Paulo Freirean notion of education, in many ways the students were teaching the teachers as much as the teachers were teaching the students. So they received an informal Freedom School education by just getting to know young people in Mississippi. And this is one of the historic points I'd like to make clear here today, is that in terms of civic engagement, we can't dismiss those we're working with as sort of, as Ferry would say, or others, a blank slate, that they bring nothing to the table. Education can only begin once we realize the background of our students and what they're bringing to the table. And just recognizing that very basic fact can lead to quite transformative education. And this is something that the white activists don't really talk about. You sort of have to read between the lines and analyze what they're doing, but this is something that's coming out, is that getting to know your students will lead to a much more effective institution, or a much more effective education. Also, there was a grave misperception that Freedom School was somehow going to be safe, that if you taught in a Freedom School, you're going to be removed from sort of the violence of the movement. This is a picture of what was supposed to be a Freedom School in Philadelphia, Mississippi. It was burned a week before Freedom Summer actually began. And this is the church burning that the three activists were investigating before they were pulled over by the Klan killed and then buried in an earthen dam. So something else to consider too is that people tend to think, well, education is far less exciting than voter registration. Education is not out there protesting, what have you. But historically, education is on an equal plane with voter registration, with protesting. That education, in those who are very interested in defending the status quo, they view education very similarly to the more active or visible forms of protest as well. So education then and now is certainly not safe in terms of challenging the status quo. Okay, so what did civic engagement actually look like in the Freedom Schools? One, again, this is well before the time that we're talking about multicultural education or culturally relevant pedagogy, but this is what they were practicing. The curriculum was based on the interests of the students. So a lot of times, and I don't recommend this for the future teachers in the room, but they began Freedom School by asking students what they wanted to learn. And Mark Levy tells a story. He's a Jewish teacher from Brooklyn who moves to Mississippi for that summer. His students wanted to learn French, and this is in Meridian, Mississippi. His students wanted to learn French because white students were offered French in their all-white segregated school. And in their minds, they thought something was wrong with them because their schools weren't offering French. So they wanted to learn French because white students were learning that. And by the end of the summer, they were able, they found someone who could speak French, and they grasped the fundamentals of French by the end of the summer. And what this taught them was a very important lesson. By engaging in the curriculum that they helped determine, they learned not only that they had skills that the system was telling them they did not have, but they were also learning the institutional discrimination, that if they could learn French, why were they not being offered French in their segregated black school? Well, the reasons of politics and discrimination and segregation were the reasons. There was nothing wrong with them. In other words, there's something wrong with the system. So culturally relevant pedagogy led to institutional critique, which was another objective of the Freedom Schools, to get students to question rather than accept the laws of Mississippi. So we have a culturally relevant pedagogy. The curriculum is based on the interests of the students. When you go through, I spent about 4 pages in the book just listing the authors that they were reading many times for the first time. They were reading abolitionist literature. They were reading Frederick Douglass for the first time. Richard Wright, even though he graduates from Jackson, Mississippi, they were reading him for the first time. James Baldwin's particularly a popular author during this time period. So they're reading black authors oftentimes for the first time in a Freedom School as well. In the instruction itself, I'll get back to it. Instruction itself was student-centered and, as I mentioned, based on the interests of the students. There's a lot of discussion. There's not a lot of rote memorization or lecture. Students, as you can see here, and these are pictures from the Meridian Freedom School, which is the single largest freedom school in the state. It had nearly 200 students. Very much based on students' discourse, sort of a seminar style of education. Also, here's Anthony Harris. He's now a professor of English and he's now actually an administrator in Mercer College outside of Atlanta, Georgia. But they're also teaching, and you notice that picture of Eddie James Carthen with the typewriter. They were teaching students how to write editorials and newspapers. They had a Freedom School newspaper. Every Freedom School had a Freedom School newspaper. So they're writing critiques of the social order as well. And some of these, I have another book, and the holidays are coming up. I think this book and another one could make for great stocking stuffers, perhaps, so if you're so interested. But we've actually, a colleague of mine, William Sturkey, who's a historian at University of North Carolina, we collected every published newspaper by the Freedom Schools, and when you read these critiques that these 10, 11, 12-year-olds, you're surprised that they weren't arrested on the spot. They're very scathing critiques that these young people were provided, and quite sophisticated given their age, of providing institutional critique. So you can see how the Freedom School model was working, was that they were learning a way to not only how to critique society, but also using the press as a vehicle for social change as well. And this led to, and here's a picture of the Milestone Freedom School. You see Eddie James Carthen in the middle. I think this really captures the sort of tone, the confidence of Freedom School students. marching out of a schoolhouse, ready to join the front lines. And Freedom School students, by the end of the summer, were quite active. They were registering voters into the Mississippi Freedom Democratic movement. They were, again, as I mentioned, publishing newspapers that were critiquing the political, social, and economic order of Mississippi. They were in some of the Freedom Day demonstrations, marching with picket signs. They were being arrested. And the most impressive form of activism comes after all these white volunteers leave. And just as the organizers intended, a lot of these Freedom School students initiated local protests after the students left. So after the volunteers left, the students remain in place and they begin local movements. So for instance, they start a Mississippi Student Union, which coordinates statewide school walkouts and boycotts. They attempt to desegregate schools for the first time in Mississippi history, so they're trying to, get into white schools. They initiate in school boycotts. For instance, there's 140 students suspended and then expelled from Mississippi schools in Indianola and Jackson, Mississippi for wearing SNCC one man, one vote buttons, and the principal asks them to take them off, and they don't, so they're suspended and then later expelled. And their parents actually come to support them, and this becomes two court cases, one Burnside v. Briers of 1966 and Blackwell versus Issaquah County of that same year. You may have heard of the Tinker v. Des Moines decision, right, which gave students the constitutional right to wear a black armband. Well, the legal precedent actually comes from the court cases brought forth by Mississippi students and their parents, because to them they argued it was a First Amendment issue to wear those SNCC buttons, and the Supreme Court agreed that wearing a black armband in protest of the war in Vietnam, it actually started with the Mississippi Freedom Movement. In addition to that, we had the Civil Rights, they were enforcing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Freedom School students go on to desegregate movie theaters, ice cream parlors, grocery stores, swimming pools. So we see a very direct correlation between education, a culturally relevant education, civic engagement, and actual changes in the state that you would least expect changes to actually occur were a result of a youth movement in Mississippi. Being mindful of time. And they went on to become something else too, so this connects to the research, I hear research, Dr. Levitt, I think was mentioned, and Dr. Dines was talking about, if I'm not mistaken, about someone in political science measuring, I think it's political efficacy of a certain type of civic education linked to advocacy. Freedom Schools is a historic example that if you learn about this in school, this leads to a tremendous boost in efficacy and also a lifelong commitment to forms of activism. Eddie James Carthen becomes the first and youngest black school board member in the state of Mississippi. Then he becomes the second black mayor in the state of Mississippi. Aurelia Mitchell, she did allow me to use this picture. She's the African-American woman pictured across from George Bush Sr. She becomes a journalist, a critical journalist. She now has a black newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee. This is Hezekiah Watkins, becomes a business owner in Jackson and is a leader of many philanthropic and also civic organizations. So a lot of these Freedom School students go on to become active, so they remain active, in other words. It's a tremendous historic example of civic engagement and how we can inspire this throughout a lifetime. So to conclude, where does this leave us today? When we follow the history of young people and we follow them throughout their lives, we can begin to see that education still, to this day, 60 plus years after the Brown decision, remains a critical issue of civil rights in 2017. We begin to see the need for grassroots organization. The Algebra Project, founded by Dave Dennis and Bob Moses within the tradition of Septima Clark and Ella Baker, looking to organizing students and their parents to demand a quality education. It's very curious that the United States does not recognize education as a right in our United States Constitution, which necessarily puts us at the state and local level. And again, this is not a black-white issue. If you follow the Hispanic and Latino community in Provo, I don't know the situation. I didn't have all the time in the world to do the research before I came here, but I can guess that Several of the schools, at least around here, have a majority Hispanic population. And if there's school choice in Provo, which I know there is, you may begin to hear reasons where, oh, I'm going to send my children to a different school, to a different district because they offer something else, right? This is a remnant of segregated schools, and we see schools segregated to a similar degree to what we see in the 1950s and 60s. So in other words, education may not be as visible as taking a knee, for instance, or joining the marches and protests and becoming arrested, but education truly is getting into the fundamental nature of our democracy. And civic engagement at least requires us to examine education. And when it comes time for our children to go to schools, that we don't look at the issue as parents only. We can look at them, to build upon the session this morning. Let's use research, let's use rational thinking to examine our schools, not just as parents, but what do these schools mean to our democracy? What type of civic engagement is taught in our schools? Are we teaching Hispanic and Latino history in our schools? I know Provo, right, is home to a lot of increased immigration. Are we expecting immigrants to learn English, or is the predominantly white population learning the culture and language of those coming to our communities as well? So today, Freedom School education provides us not only lessons, but the questions that we need to be asking in order to make quality education a reality for all students today. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to questions.
So the benefit of having only one person with a mic is that we can't talk over each other. So if we do something like this, there we go. We have two others who have read the paper and have comments. We'll allow them, they'll go about 7 minutes apiece. We'll allow our author to respond to any of those comments that he would like to. Following what I hope is a very interesting dynamic up here, we're going to open it up for questions among the audience. If you have questions, please write them down. If the discussions spur your thinking on some questions that you might have for Dr. Hale, please be prepared when we finish up here. Again, there'll be maybe 15 minutes total with this, and then we will open it up to you for some questions. And I was going to go ladies first. You want to go first? Okay. Well,
all right, so first of all, just to thank Dr. Hale for a wonderful paper. I think my hope is that I can point to some things. I fear a little bit that I'm going to be going off to the side or running alongside or reading on top of in some way, and we won't appreciate the quality and value of the work. We already were told it's 52 pages, yes, and 121 footnotes, so this is well-researched stuff. I'd encourage, if anybody's interested in the historical method and seeing how to do it, this is a perfect example of that, including oral history as well as working in the archives. So my comments, I'm trying to decide how much to decide to note. I gotta get my timer going, so keep me in mind. In some ways, I want to kind of push the conversation to what may be the next step in this. We've got the decentering of sort of the white activists and the recentering of black Southerners, and one of the things I want to do is kind of get thinking about what's between those, right? As an anthropologist, this is something that I'm very interested in. The kind of thing is this issue of the relationships between, and this is something that I think Dr. Hale's piece points out very nicely, and I'll be talking about the anthropological notion of kinship here in just a little bit. So I want to put two arguments out there. The first one is to say that freedom schoolers essentially became anthropologists. We could say ethnographers, we could say social scientists, but I think they really were anthropologists in what they were doing. They were doing field work here is a way of thinking about this. And the second is that one of the most essential and powerful aspects of what happened in the summer of '64 was what I've already mentioned in anthropological circles we talk about as kinship, this notion of kinning, right? So part of this is we have to think of kinship as something more than just blood relations and marriage, although that's part of it, and that becomes an important part of what happens here. But there's also kinning, the process of making kin and creating kin. But before doing that, I did want to mention there is something interesting here, and not to do too much of the work that Dr. Hill's working against, about the context in which everybody was working, the spectacular nature of the work that the Freedom Schoolers were doing. And I had some Gallup numbers. I'll kind of skip over too many of the details just to tell you that this was a context in which people in early 1960s, people felt like this was a futile effort, that this was not something, and maybe even worse than that. Many people felt that this was doing harm to blacks in the South. This whole movement, all of this work. Now imagine that being somebody who's suddenly jumping on a bus to go and do this work of the Freedom Schoolers, and in this context in which everybody's saying, you're actually harming the people you're trying to help and serve. So I think that's important. So given this context, one kind of wonders how it is that the Freedom Schoolers did what they did, and the answer that Dr. Hill gives, and then I'll return to in a minute, is they did it with a lot of help, a lot of local help, of course, most particularly those people from the South that they came to serve, right? Perhaps save, maybe. We keep that in mind. I think that's important. And who also had the most to gain and the most to lose by participating in this movement. That's another side of it. The black Southerners had the most to lose. They could die much easier than a white Northerner. You'd hear about it if a white Northerner died, a black Southerner dying, you'd be much less likely to hear about it. But first I wanted to take a closer look at what it was the Freedom Schoolers did. So it's been well documented, as Dr. Hill notes, that they set up schools to teach a number of different topics, including things like French, as we heard, as well as how to engage in effective and consequential protests. And so there's been a lot of focus on that. But whereas others have focused more on that aspect, Hale turns his analytic lens outward to the study, not just of what is happening inside classrooms, but also what is happening around them. And I'd add that I often tell my students who are new to anthropology that anthropology is the science of studying around. The premise here is if you want to understand a phenomenon, you have to understand what is going on around that phenomenon. And to put it slightly differently, no phenomena can exist outside of a context. So that's sort of a scientific concern there. So Hale shows us that these teachers themselves were also doing the work of studying around. They were not simply going into the classroom and teaching and then going home to their own homes and families. That would have been impossible, right, given where their families were. Instead, since they lived with the families of their students, for these teachers, going home at the end of the day meant going to someone else's home. And this meant living with, eating with, working with, sleeping with people whom they were very different from. They were doing what we in anthropology refer to as field work, living with and among the people whom you're seeking to better understand. And as such, they learned about the intimate lives of people that they had come to serve. As Hale describes, some even went so far as to produce field notes, rich ethnographic descriptions, he didn't mention that much about here, but it's in the paper, of their experiences that were then published in northern newspapers, giving white northerners a much more intimate understanding of the lives of black Southerners. So I'd suggest that this anthropological nature is what can help us to avoid, or we'll just call it a field school, a living with people that we seek to serve and help. And I'm cautious about that, but I think that it's important to keep that alive, right? Keep the possibility of doing that kind of work alive. And I think there's something, an impulse there that is valuable, even if it is condescending. I think this can help us avoid the twin troubles that anthropologist Oscar Lewis, who also happens to be the one who introduced this notion of the culture of poverty, which is very, very problematic. But he describes the poles of brutalization and sentimentality of the poor. So Lewis's point is that both of these impulses toward an oppressed group can be dangerous because they reduce others to less than the complex and complicated humans that we know ourselves to be. Jane Addams, the mind behind Chicago's settlement houses of the early 20th century and the mother of the discipline known as social work, opposed a university philanthropic initiative to establish a settlement house, and she said, what is needed is understanding. We don't need to do this philanthropic work. We shouldn't be doing it as going out and some sort of do-gooder impulse of we're going to save these people. We should do it as the most important thing we need to do is understand. She said interpretation is actually the word that she used. Interpretation is what we need. So this is a critical point. It points to the problem of charity. And I'll only briefly touch on this, but this is a problem that anthropologists have talked about, such as Mary Douglas, who describes there are no free gifts in her introduction to Marcel Mauss's The Gift. And Mauss himself documents how the gift can be poisoned. So think of that, the possibility and the challenge that charitable acts can be poisonous, right, insofar as they are condescending, and have that sense of condescension, of the lowering of one and the raising of the other. Something that is essential to attend to in civic anthropological, or civic engagement work, as well as anthropological work. So in closing, I'll just, I didn't get to mention much about the issue of kinship and the way in which these really strong kinning happens between white Northerners and the black Southerners that they were living with. But you see it in all of these new kinship ways of kinning, of working with people, which is one way that you can form kinship, eating with people as well, but also some of the more traditional ways of establishing affinal relations between man and wife, husband and wife. So in closing, I'd like to again thank Dr. Hill for his work in this paper and for shedding important light on what is happening around the freedom schools, including the freedom schoolers and Southern blacks who themselves were seeking understanding of one another, and who by doing so form bonds of kinship, bonds strong enough to endure the threat of the gift. And the point for us too is for us to recognize the absolutely essential nature of living with and living alongside of those with whom we seek to critically engage. Thank you.
Okay, I'm so glad that John was asked to participate in this conference on civic engagement. His work really brings to the fore the important role of young people in the civil rights movement, which is something that I've been a wee bit interested in myself. And further shows us how kind of young people acting on the front lines. And you may not be aware of just how important the rich oral history work that he did, how important that is in bringing out the voices and perspectives of these freedom school kids. And he forces us across disciplines, I think, to take seriously young people as political actors. And I think this is really important as we think about meaningful engagement and problem solving in our communities, the nation, and the world. During Freedom Summer, there have been some highs and lows, some successes, and some truly heartbreaking frustrations and disappointments. Freedom schools, as he mentioned, were one of the high points, right? This was a high point, a great success. Young blacks flocked to freedom schools with or without their parents' permission in numbers that defied organizers' most optimistic expectations. Whatever other failures they encountered, Fusco, who we mentioned, understood in the end that the real transformation of Mississippi and of the movement could be measured by the increased questioning and activism of young people during and in the wake of Freedom Summer. It wasn't that white folks were suddenly paying more attention because of the participation of white college students. It was the transformation of these young people. Bob Moses similarly recognized that those freedom school kids, are the seeds of change. Moses, Fusco, and other organizers understood that young people's stage in human development leaves them more open to change and more willing to act than adults, or many adults. But that there are conditions under which young people are able or not to strike out and claim other possibilities. So I thought that what I would do is kind of step back and think about what we might take from the freedom school model from this history. And I want to make a few observations and then throw this open. So schools in particular, civic education programs, right, especially at mid-century, but even today, were and are designed to mold young people by training, environment, example, and adult organization and supervision into good Americans who embody dominant cultural, social, and political values. And John alluded to this in his comments as well. Childhood has long been understood to be a dynamic condition, But adults in society and its institutions have largely tried to channel young people into predetermined roles in existing institutional structures to produce self-disciplined individuals who have been invisibly conditioned to regard social values, the status quo, as expressions of their own nature and desires. Civil rights activists in 1964 imagined, on the other hand, that young people could and should be encouraged to shape society, to challenge its dominant institutions, its economic and political models, and its frameworks for understanding, developing, and guiding their behavior and self and social conceptions. They also believe that children have mighty things to do, to quote an article from the NAACP's Crisis magazine, in the present, not just in the future. So freedom schools really start out with a belief in child capability, an affirmation of real childhood agency, including a childhood political agency. Freedom school kids are not imagined as victims. Now, individual volunteers, as John suggested, might come in with this white savior mentality, but there was a learning curve, right, for these volunteers. And organizers came to understand and appreciate and to affirm young people's own vitality. They come in and the program is designed and the curriculum is designed to respect the experience and perspectives of rural Southern Black children. These kids, they recognize, already have a high level of political consciousness that came as a result of personal experience with the politics of Jim Crow and white supremacy. They can tell the difference, as Robert Coles, who was a child psychiatrist working in the rural South at the time, between a piece of real meat and streak-o-lean. And this comes from an interview that he conducted with a young activist. And because they know and see, and because these young people are in this open stage of human development, they can remake the world. And they already are, right? And they see that. They're already active. We have Eddie James Crafter and Aurelia Mitchell and others who have this deep heritage of resistance, and volunteers come to appreciate and try to help them build on this. Freedom School teachers, despite some of their original assumptions, take on an adult shaping presence, but they are meant to be facilitators, sounding boards, learners themselves, and the schools are intended to be the creation of young people, as John's explained. Organizers and teachers have, or at least come to have, an appreciation for the fortitude and inscrutability of children and youth in the face of pain, in the face of the dehumanizing facts of segregation and white supremacy. These children and youth are already confronting oppression and already standing up to it. Freedom schools become a space for them to reconstruct their view of themselves and their community and their potential for resistance. Freedom schools aim to help young people transform psychologically at a critical moment in history. And this psychological liberation, more than any content that they're providing, and you get a sense that the content itself is specifically and carefully selected, right, to achieve the same purpose. This psychological liberation helps these young Mississippi youth to create a new identity, a new self-identity, outside of the one that's being imposed on them by the white imagination, to create a new sense of who they are and of the possible. And all of this then leads to political action. And I'm especially thinking about this notion because this week at International Cinema, we have Raoul Peck's powerful documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. And this is part of what James Baldwin in his unfinished work is trying to get us to think about kind of overcoming the white imagination of Black people and being able to assert who you are. In freedom schools, we see that the process of learning matters. And that process allows young people to see themselves or to further see themselves as creators, as actors, as powerful, as meaningful participants in civic and political life. In this model, the child certainly embodies the future of the race and of the country, but they represent that because they, in the here and now, have an authentic, creative, generative voice. White society defines Black children as a problem, and this is still the case. And as John has suggested in his interviews, he came to see in very personal ways the way that these Black children were not even allowed to be children. In freedom schools, These kids are envisioned as problem solvers. And the last point I want to make is that these schools are community-based, and that the focus is on collectivity, not achievement. These schools are not an individualistic-oriented endeavor. They aim to unleash a freedom of mind and spirit that allows and encourages a positive, not just self, but collective identity and sense of place and efficacy in the larger socio-political world, which is exactly what white supremacy doesn't want to happen, right? And John talked a little bit more about kind of the results of this sense of efficacy. So I'll leave it there and let you say it.
Hand it to John, get a few minutes to respond if you'd like.
Well, one, thank you for the comments very much. And one thing that I think is great about this conference, not only does it focus on civic engagement and the role of young people in engaging the community in meaningful ways, but it was also the interdisciplinary nature of it. So I appreciate the emphasis this earlier too. With Dr. Clay's, I never heard civil rights movement as a tectonic shift, but that's going to come from a geographer. I think that is really a way to look at it too. So Dr. Thompson, I just build a couple of ideas here. Exactly right, especially that of kinship and the process of making kin, and something I couldn't limited in time today, but the emotional bonds formed in Mississippi Freedom Summer lasted a lifetime. And just being in danger, being confronted, or your life challenged, and your life is being threatened, and you're living with people in close quarters for upwards of 3 months, forms lifetime bonds. I mean, when you consider that a lot of these activists, were suffering from PTSD, that was never diagnosed as such, but that created such important, long-lasting bonds that truly, I think it helps me to see it as kin forming or kin, as you mentioned. And that really helps explain the value and the longevity of the freedom school model, which still exists today, by the way. And then also the point and Professor Schweinsteiger brought this up as well, but the community aspect or the collective aspect was absolutely crucial. And I read about it in the book, but I didn't talk about that much today. But this one reason that the white volunteers now leave in June but left as seasoned veterans in August was that they were living in close proximity to those that they were there to serve, living in the homes of the community, going to the same grocery stores in the community, going to church in the community, to immerse oneself, almost as an anthropologist or an ethnographer, truly led to not only new ways to understand their students in Mississippi itself, but also to understand themselves. And today when you look at education, and there's no requirement to live in the community. In cities like Chicago where there is a requirement, people go to the most gentrified neighborhoods that they can, away from where their students live. And there's no way I'm suggesting to make education great again, because education back then was segregated, violent, and we progressed a lot. But I do think we lost sight of the utility and benefit of teachers living in the community in proximity to their students. Just really helps shape a powerful education experience. Professor Schweinsteiger, the idea about imagining young people, the use of imagination, that's what the Freedom School, I think, is a really powerful way to look at that, because to imagine young people as activists was going against the trend. So imagine Dr. King and the children in the Birmingham Children's Crusade, when he decided to allow over 1,000 young people to march and to be arrested and to be the victims of O'Connor's infamous fire hoses. 2 days later, Malcolm X says in the New York Times, real men don't allow children to do their dirty work, or something like that. That imagination came with a cost, right? And that's a very courageous imagination, to see young people as activists, to see young people with the capability to, in fact, not only imagine but then change the world is even today quite courageous. If you're a professor without tenure, hers is with you, but sees students as change agents, that's going against the grain. So that's actually, I think, quite dangerous, but that imagination is absolutely crucial. And the idea about forming a new identity is really what's necessary in education in many ways, to get children not to accept what society is telling them, but to give them the tools to re-envision or to reimagine who they are in this quite dangerous, problematic society. It's tools that are going to provide skills that last a lifetime. So I wish I could go back and rewrite passages based on this panel. And I also wish both of you could write a book review. Thank you very much for your comments.
All right, go ahead. All right, with that, I'm glad that so many were able to stay. I know we had a class block that started at noon, and many students had to take off. For those that are here, questions for any member of our panel or for Dr. Hale directly, please go ahead. You're first and right behind you.
Okay. I don't actually have a question, more of a comment. I've been a public educator for the last 20 years, and a geographer in particular. And through the study of geography, you see this increased ability of movement of people and ideas, which, facilitated through digital technology, enables people to only hear the voices they want to hear. And we also see the increased isolation and segregation of society, as was mentioned, I believe, where people are moving into socioeconomically and ideologically the neighborhoods that only reflect their own values and choices. Which means, to me, that the need for civil discourse and dialogue and debate in public education classrooms, and I'm not just talking social studies, I'm talking science, math, and English as well, where teachers know how to teach civil discourse and engage kids in the writing and speaking from different points of view. And so if any of you young people are going into education or have an opportunity to work with young people to help them with this, it's crucial, and I'd encourage you to look into it.
Yeah, one of the challenges from that as an educator is when you allow your students to begin this discourse, it often doesn't continue as civil, right? Because they're so used to, when they feel like when their idea is being attacked, to attack back the individual rather than the idea. And it's very hard to moderate these when we go nasty so quickly. In my classroom, we try to do this on a regular basis. It's interesting to watch the dynamic. Been doing it for about 15 years as it's changed a little bit over time. Okay, behind you, my student, yeah.
So, as you were talking, I kept thinking about a class that I've taken about international development of education, and we talked a lot in the class about the rights to education versus rights in education. And I felt like a lot of what you were talking about was like a lot about rights in education. A lot of people don't think about, what is this right of quality education as opposed to just a right to an education. And it made me curious, has there been anyone or any group or organization that has modeled any sort of education intervention or curriculum after the lessons that they learned from the Freedom Schools? Or are there any groups that are doing kind of like working off of similar principles?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And in terms of the curriculum, the Zen Education Project is really good in terms of packaging a curriculum for teachers to, not packaging as here's how you teach it at ABC, but I mean providing primary sources and analysis to help teachers. So Zen Education Project, Dr. Howard's the late social historian. Teaching Tolerance is pretty good as well for providing resources built on the Freedom Summer, the Freedom Summer campaign, as well as the Freedom Schools provide a curriculum that's accessible, digitized, and very good for teachers as well. I would always point students and teachers to the SNCC Legacy Project, and they've digitized a lot of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee papers and speeches, correspondence, et cetera, that are really accessible in the classroom, just to name a few. And then in terms of a group, I referenced initially the Algebra Project. I think the lesson coming out of Freedom Summer was if you engage students and their parents where they are and engage them in questions that seem, very, it's in some cases almost shallow. How do I get better textbooks in the classroom? Or in this case, how do I ensure that algebra is taught in 7th or 8th grade to prepare my kids to take advanced mathematics in order to get into college? That raises questions like the lessons learned in Meridian about French. It raises questions about, well, how come it's not being offered in 7th grade here, but across town in a white school it's offered in 7th grade? And then that gets parents engaged in the process. It gets them asking questions about the distribution of resources, and then it engages parents and their children in how to actually affect tangible change. And this has to happen at the local level because it is not a protected constitutional right. So you have to engage parents at the local level. And if you follow the Elder Project, you see that they have a track record of success in engaging parents, those who are most affected by the problem, not college students or volunteers, right? Those who have to rely on public education, getting them involved is a solution we really need to be looking at in terms of increasing a right both to and in education.
Let's go here then here.
I want to make a comment because you were talking about the importance of sort of celebrating the youth and actually empowering them. And I think after hearing the talk, like there was a parallel there because they were being treated as adults criminally. And so they probably felt like they wanted that level of agency in their own lives because they were having that experience, that lived experience of being criminalized. If anyone hasn't seen the documentary 13th, please watch it. Anyway, the other comment I wanted to make, and I wanted to ask you, Dr. Hale, is, you know, as a white male, with your positionality in doing this research, like how you navigated that to really make sure that you weren't even necessarily having a perception of the white savior complex, even if that wasn't necessarily your intention.
Yeah, so my own positionality, in my awareness of it is constantly changing, and especially moving to Charleston. I've been over there 6 years now, and that's really changed how I view this research, and it's really changed my life. Because I'm going to live less than a mile from the AME church, we're doing open fire in the Bible study, killing our AME members. And also being in the community and organizing what has now become the Quality Education Project. And I'm constantly, and there's nothing like, you know, being a white Wisconsinite in black spaces, in, you know, in a town where 40% of all slaves went through it, right? I mean, I get called out all the time, and now I'm not so sensitive to it because I think it's a good question to ask and call it should. So, you know, I think it's one of white scholars, you shouldn't be intimidated by looking at that or saying this isn't my history. I think there's two lessons to important. One, if you have to learn the perspective and you have to build trust in circles, which I think idea of kinship. Once you're seen but not heard, you know, people know you as someone who's genuinely interested in that. It's okay to begin to talk about that. That it's clear that you're not there to promote your own career, which is difficult because you write a book on it. But I mean, you know, to earn trust in the community that you're with, that comes over years. And the second is also to know that it's not a black or Latino problem per se. It's more of a white problem. And it's a national problem. So white people need to talk to white people about race and how we talk about it. And that's something that people of color can't do in the United States. It requires white people to engage in these difficult conversations. And when Ta-Nehisi Coates was in Charleston in May, it was actually right after I received the invitation here. He was giving a speech. He was like, I was invited, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, I was invited to Utah, of all places. And I was curious to see how they dealt with race. I think, well, that's kind of a, I didn't agree with that. Utah is a very important state to have these conversations about whiteness and how whiteness is defined and conceptualized and constructed, right? Utah is a key place, just as Wisconsin is, to understand whiteness and its impact on race. So I may have floated around the issue, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, so I have a few questions, one for Dr. Hill and one for, I forgot your name, so sorry. But so Dr. Hill, when comparing, so you talked about kind of the lifelong activism that came out of the students who went to freedom schools. Were most of those, I guess part one, were most of those students in integrated schools during the school year? And is there any sort of relationship between the students who were in integrated white schools and their lifelong activism versus the freedom school students and their activism?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I don't have enough time to answer it fully, but one of the books I'm working on now, history. 3 minutes. I'm teasing. I'm engaged in a new book on the history of school choice that gets a little bit more. But Mississippi was the last state to desegregate. They did that in August of 1964. And they started in kindergarten and first grade. So no freedom school students went to a desegregated school in 1964 and 1965. What you have, though, are black students going back to black schools, challenging policies to govern black students. So wearing a SNCC pin and being expelled, they challenged that. They wanted a norm, an African-American curriculum, so they challenged that. So yes, in black schools, they were more active in trying to improve the quality of education at all black schools. For students across the South and North who went to desegregated schools, that itself was the form of activism. Desegregating a white school, being the best of your race as you were encouraged to be, that was a form of activism. So yes, activism occurred in both, but they look very different. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in those young people, Nielsen Brown has a really good project. It's called Somebody Had to Do It, and to look at those oftentimes horrifying stories of people who desegregated.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, remind me your name.
Deschweinitz, Rebecca Deschweinitz.
Okay. So you talked about the value of the freedom schools and reconstructing their own and students' own perceptions of themselves, as well as this sort of psychological liberation. Are there other groups of people that would benefit, other demographics like other gender minorities or racial minorities that you think would benefit from this structure of who are in need of that psychological liberation? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime that there are definitions of who you are, I'll go back to the film that showed at International Cinema this week, right? It's based on an unfinished book by James Baldwin, I Am Not Your Negro, right? Dominant groups, imagining who people are, and determining kind of what the narrative is about other people and perpetuating stereotypes. Those are so important to break down and for people to be able to imagine themselves in their own way and according to their own terms. So, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Please. So, Dr. Hells, in 2004 you said, or you just mentioned that in 2004 you started to interview a lot of people, and then in 2016 you published your book. And so I was wondering if you noticed any changes in emotions in your interviewees with a lot of the past current events that's been happening the last 5 years, with a lot of racial tensions that have been happening.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So 2004, I began graduate school,
Okay.
Which I wrote my dissertation, which I defended in 2009. Between 2009 and 2014, I basically rewrote my dissertation. So it typically doesn't take that long. Well, sometimes it does. It depends. So I thought you were criticizing how long it took. Yeah, hold on. But then having said that, so it takes a year to actually put it in print. So when I turned in my page proofs, that was January of 2016. So the election was a long way off. And in January 2016, just like November 1st, 2016, no one ever would have imagined what would happen, right? But what was very emotional for a lot of people, especially Aurelia Mitchell, who was a journalist, when I first started really transcribing people, it was about 2008, 2009, when President Obama was elected, and everybody was elated, and it was a very positive sort of moment in people's lives. And Aurelia Mitchell was able to meet then Senator Obama, right? And they knew people who died for the right to vote, and to see President Obama elected at this point, or about to be elected, was incredibly inspirational and emotional for them. So, and I think that comes through in the book. It's something you criticize, like a little too optimistic or something, because I guess apparently history shouldn't be that optimistic, but it was a very positive story at that time for a lot of these participants. And then since following up with them, which has been off the record after November, it's been the opposite effect. A lot of people have said, which has been hard for me to hear, where they say, I hear my whole life's work has gone down the drain in an election, or I feel as if everything I've stood for, and now they're 70, 75, 80 years old, and they should be interviewed like World War II veterans were interviewed with Steven Stewart, because these are war veterans and we're losing them daily. They really feel conflicted at this stage in their life because they devoted their entire careers to social change, and what they feel has happened recently, especially after Charlottesville, has been really sort of hard to hear them process what's happening, because in many ways they can't. They've seen people die for reasons that are resurfacing now. I don't know, does that help answer
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
your question? Yeah, but I wish I could write an epilogue after the election to talk about what happened, because a lot of activists are rethinking their very philosophies at this stage now in ways, for someone who's always looked up to them, it's hard for me to hear. Wait a second, I believe that too, and now your question, and it poses very serious questions about our democracy.
Yep, I think we're actually just past time. Join me please in thanking the panel.